G'day everybody, it's Joe here again. In this video, I'm going to investigate that first question that pops into your head after you've made the decision to be a game master, and that is, what sort of game am I going to run? Now, there's two components to this. The first component is the genre of the game. Is it going to be science fiction? Is it going to be a crime thriller? Is it going to be a western? Is it going to be a pure fantasy hack and slash high heroics? And even within those broad descriptions, there'll be nuances. For example, am I going to play a swashbuckling, sort of Flash Gordon or Edgar Rice Burroughs science fiction? Am I going to play a dark, gritty, realistic science fiction set in the world of mystery and cyberpunk? Or am I going to run a horror science fiction where my characters are going to get gleefully munched by aliens and monsters and other things? So, definitely you'll be looking and thinking about your genre well before you start to look at the second component of this decision, which is, what rule system am I going to run? Now, it's very easy for a game master to pick up a world setting, and I've got plenty of them here. It's Only War, Realms of Cthulhu, there's plenty of these books, and that's great. One of the quick things that you can do is, if you want to blend the decision between taking a world setting and having rules for it, just go and buy them. And there's some really, really, great information in these products. But you might also want to go one step further than that, which is building your own world entirely, which is also okay, but you do still need to make that decision about the rule system. Now, when we start to talk about the rule system, there's a couple of things you need to think about. The first one, and probably the most important one for me, is, does the rule system match the world setting? So if you take a rule system, for example, that's very, very miniatures heavy and very rules heavy, and you apply it to a storyline to be played with children about fairies and foxes, it's not going to work. It's obviously not going to work. Now, that's an extreme case, but actually it cuts through all gaming experiences. If you're wanting to tell a narrative story, then you need a narrative rule system. Which begs the question, what are the general types of rule systems out there? Well, I break them down into a couple of different categories. The biggest category, I think, out there, certainly one of the most popular categories, is actually what I call the crunchy category. And that's where you've got lots of rules. They're very detailed. Quite often they'll involve miniatures, but not always. So a good example of that is pretty much all of the Dark Heresy and all of the Warhammer 40k rule systems. The preeminent example of that would have to be Dungeons and Dragons, especially 3.5 and 4. Very, very crunchy. Lots of rule books. Great for rules lawyers. Now, those games themselves are incredibly enjoyable just because they have lots of rules. And let's face it, many of us gamers love the little nuances, love being able to min-max and so forth. And that is part of one style of play. So, crunchy rule settings, one area. Tabletop mini-oriented games are another. Now, they quite often cross over into that crunchy setting, but I think that it's not always the case. A good example of that would be what I call an in-betweener sort of minis game, which is the Savage Worlds rule system. Extremely flexible, supports minis, doesn't have to have minis. It's a nice in-between range. And then you've got the narrative story rule systems. Now, these, some people who really don't like them because they're too light. They don't have enough of a rule system. And they range from things such as Fate, brilliant rule system for running narrative style games, games that focus on character building and story building and so forth. Rapture, which is very narrative driven. In fact, all the combat sequences in that are resolved as a narrative, as a holistic narrative. Down to some really interesting rule systems like Primetime Adventures, which is 100% script, narrative and script development. Another extreme example, I think, of the narrative rule system would be Fiasco. Fantastic GM-less game, but don't think that you still don't have a responsibility to bring the game to play. So there's all of those styles. Those are the generic styles. I'd have to say it's more of a spectrum between hard, crunchy on one side and soft and narrative on the other side. And there's a whole bunch of different rule systems in between. So when you decide to be a GM, you first of all think of the genre you want to play, and then you have to say what rule system will match that. Do not try and hammer your favorite rule system into the narrative, because it just won't work. Now, the second part of deciding what sort of rule system you're going to do, besides matching the narrative and the rule system, is know your players. If you have a gaming group that clearly enjoys narrative games, do not try and run a crunchy game with them. They won't enjoy it. It's simple as that. And likewise, if you have a game group that loves the minis, don't try and run a fluffy narrative game with them, unless you've checked with them that they're keen to play that. The reality is, though, that most game groups are fairly mixed and are prepared to try something new, but don't think that you're going to get a big story arc out of that. So definitely take the players into consideration. Something else that you'll want to think about when you start to choose a game is your decision about, are you going to run this as an epic story arc? Or is this going to be a mini-series? Or is this just going to be a one-shot? And again, check with your gaming groups about how that is going to run. If they're all keen that they're going to meet weekly or bi-weekly or whenever, and they're all keen to follow the storyline on, by all means do a story arc. Generally what I do when I start to create a story arc is I try to run a one-off, like a pilot episode. And that way I can actually judge whether or not the gaming group is going to enjoy the rest of the storyline. And I'm very explicitly, I ask them, did you enjoy this and do you want more of the same? Do you want to take this forward? And really listen carefully, because your friends are likely to say, yeah, that was really good, yeah. But you really need to listen for, did they really love it? And are they invested in that story arc? So that's one good way of determining if you should continue with the story arc. Then of course you've got the one-shots. Now I love one-shot adventures. We've got a gaming group that only looks at one-shot adventures. So you can certainly follow through on just creating a whole series of one-shot adventures. And another trick is that you can blend the one-shot adventures into each other. So there are some of the things that you need to think about when you're thinking about being the Game Master the first time. In future videos, we're going to unpack that a little bit more and take a look at individual types of rule systems. So looking forward to it. Catch you later. Bye.